This is not the first time I've covered a film that I've talked about before, but it's the first time that I've decided to readdress a film that I've reviewed in the past on this show. Once upon a very, very long time ago, in a galaxy that was very, very far away, I was only a couple of months into doing the original Movie Nuts series back in 2010. This was back when I had the microphone that made it sound like I was recording from inside a dustbin, and, well, one of my targets at the time was the 2010 adaptation, or rather adaptation sequel thingy that Tim Burton gave us in conjunction with Disney, his Alice in Wonderland. Although really it should have been called Alice in Underland, but that's semantics. In my original review, I summed up the film as perfectly passable fantasy fare, but ultimately not what it could have been. So all these years later, what do I feel about it? Do I still hold to that? Do I think it's better? Do I think it's worse? What could I have really new to add that I didn't cover before? Well, aside from the fact that at the time I didn't have the greatest speaking skills and I tended to repeat myself and, ramble, because at the time I was under the impression that scripts are for losers, the review really suffered for it. So I feel now that I've had all that experience under my belt, I can articulate myself a little bit better, especially given that, I've covered other similar projects like Oz the Great and Powerful before on this show, and so can talk about Alice with a little more precision than I did last time. So what's the real big linchpin for me with this movie? What is the big thing that I feel is its greatest, perhaps, strike or sin, whatever you want to call it? Well, really, it gets down to the fact that, honestly, it seems to pretty much go contrary to the entire point of what is Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland, the original novel, was a celebration of imagination. It was also very dark and very, unafraid to be a little bit morose and morbid at points, especially with the characters of the different kings and queens and dukes and duchesses. But ultimately, it was a journey into the mind of a child. And in that case, it makes sense in a weird way why the story doesn't make a lot of sense. It's supposed to be the child's view of the world, how they take things in. So a lot of things seem very ridiculous because that's how a kid views a lot of the rigidity of the world. Like, for example, if you were a Victorian child, you would probably have to go to an awful lot of tea parties and tea ceremonies with your parents, and all that ritual and uprightness probably seemed really tired and boring to you. So of course it makes sense that in her mind, Alice would imagine a really absurd version of the party with the Mad Hatter and the March Hare and all these nonsensical rules. Indeed, despite being a children's story, it's also very much following in the footsteps of a lot of other 19th century literature, in that it's also sort of a thinly veiled critique of certain aspects of Victorian society, in the same way that, say, Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde was a critique of the way that Victorians loved to button everything up and weren't willing to confront issues relating to morality, ethics, or really even sexuality, which was a big taboo. This story is a critique of a lot of the pomp and circumstance of Victorian society, which Carol, who is not exactly the most outward-going of people, would naturally have an issue with. And it's in all that the film doesn't really work as a sequel, because it really misses the point of the whole thing. In fact, it pretty much does something on top of that, which is it tries to fuse a completely different style of writing and a completely different type of fantasy writer with Carol, and that would be pretty obviously J.R.R. Tolkien. That three-act epic fantasy with monsters and swords and armies and big battles, it's just... Tolkien and Carol are completely different types of fantasy writers. Trying to fuse them together is not the best of ideas. It's like if Steven Spielberg made The Human Centipede. It just doesn't fit. One is all about the absurdity of imagination, no rules. The other is very much about rules. Tolkien was a very descriptive writer and had very clearly set down things for what do and don't happen in the world of Middle-earth. And so trying to mix them together seems like a real contradiction. It ultimately comes off as if screenwriter Linda Wolverton, who, has had a pretty significant fall from grace despite being involved in the Disney Renaissance, just thought to herself, Why would I want to just write a story that's all about telling kids to rejoice in imagination? Why would they want that? We can't sell toys to that. We need to make it big and loud, and we got to get all the kids in. So let's make a big action movie. Let's make it a super compressed Lord of the Rings. Let's take out all the zaniness, or at least the real zaniness of the original story and the various other versions, including Disney's past version, and let's just make it this thing where it's kind of quirky, but at the end of the day, it's like every other fantasy film that was released after the success of Return of the King that wasn't Harry Potter. And that's really my big pet peeve with it, is the fact that the film, for all of the talent here, both behind and in front of the camera, just feels so pedestrian. Literally, anybody else could have done this film, and it would have come out the same way. Tim Burton's name is more here for value than any real other reason. He doesn't seem to put that much of himself in this story. Which is weird, because I remember a time when everybody was excited at the thought of Tim Burton doing an Alice in Wonderland film, and I still believe he could do a great one. Really, when it comes to modern filmmakers, there's only two that would really fit Alice in Wonderland, and that's Burton and Terry Gilliam. And Terry Gilliam already kind of did an Alice in Wonderland movie called Tideland, which, despite being an incredible mess of a film and really mean-spirited, at least felt more like an actual Alice in Wonderland film than this did. But moving past any kind of fealty to the material and just looking at the film on its own, as I said, it's just kind of like everything else. It's not poorly presented, it certainly looks good, the special effects are nice, and the cast pretty much all do well, though Mia Wasikowska definitely suffers the most. Since then, she's had a chance to really prove herself as an actress, and she's been in a lot of fairly good films. But here, this is just a case of, well, hey, this was sort of that fad in the late 2000s where we'll take an Australian because, hey, Russell Crowe was so successful, and just stick him in a big movie. They did it to Sam Worthington, and they did it to Mia. As a result, she's very blank here. Compared to how good she can be in a lot of other things, the script just doesn't give her anything to do. She's either really passive or she's a smart aleck without that much edge or likability. And it really kind of does Mia's talents a disservice. But then again, let's face it, this kind of story, you don't come to see Alice, you come to see all the other characters. And well, even if it is kind of the depth show to an extent, I don't think he's bad. Well, he's certainly sort of playing a channeled version, combining his own usual brand of kind of quirkiness with, you can kind of see a faint nod to the Hannah from the original Disney film. I forget the actor's name. Edwin, I think is his name. You know, he's got kind of the weird voice, and he's got the mannerisms that kind of remind me of that Hannah, but it's still very much a depth creation, and I don't think he does it badly. Really, the big show stealer here for me was Stephen Fry as the Cheshire Cat, who I think is perhaps really the best part of the whole film, and of course Helena Bonham Carter as the Queen. She is so over the top, while he's really controlled and smooth about everything. And frankly, he has probably the best design. He's pretty much how I would imagine a Cheshire Cat designed by Tim Burton to really look like. And well, I'm a big Stephen Fry fan, so that helps as well. And then other people like Crispin Glover as the main knight, or whatever his name is, I forget right now, or Anne Hathaway's the White Queen, they're okay, but again, like Mia, they don't get that much to do. Anne is just kind of rehashing her traditional princess role as sort of the nicey-nicey, and there's really not much to say there. And, well, everybody's commented to death about how silly Crispin looks being digitally elongated, so I can't really add too much there. And then other aspects like Danny Elfman's score just feel, again, very much rote, playing more like a greatest hits of his past works with Burton than really a fully formed work in its own right. He's just recycling the same old Burton dark, quirky motifs with a really obnoxious choir, and it's just... it gets the job done, but it's just not what it could have been. And really, that's the biggest thing I have to say about Alice in Wonderland, is that it just feels like they had a really good idea here. Making a sequel to Alice and seeing what she would be like all those years later, and there have been other works that have sort of done the same idea, and it would have been interesting to see what that would have been like. Heck, I remember there was a good time when it was rumored that the Alice movie Tim Burton was going to be working on was American McGee's Alice, which I could certainly see still working. But really, was this the best thing they could come up with, to just basically compress Lord of the Rings and just slap Lewis Carroll's name on it and just call it a day? Was this really the best idea Linda had for this story?